What kinds of trains might we see as we follow Canadian Pacific's tracks through the Rocky Mountains? If we are lucky, we might see 2 passenger trains. This is the Royal Canadian Pacific, CP's premier excursion train, which was introduced in 2000. The locomotives are 1950s-era streamlined passenger locomotives, rebuilt with modern engines and electrical systems. The cars are 1920s heavyweight passenger cars, rebuilt and refurbished to luxury standards. The train runs in the summer. The Rocky Mountaineer is an excursion train that runs twice weekly in the summer. It departs from Vancouver and runs to Kamloops, where it splits with one section heading north to Jasper in Jasper National Park, and the other section heading west through the Rockies to Calgary. The locomotives are rebuilt ex-Canadian National freight locomotives. The passenger cars were built in 1954 and have been upgraded several times. The dome cars were custom built for Rocky Mountain Rail tours by Colorado Railcar. Coal trains are seen west of Golden. The coal is from the Crow's Nest coalfields in southern Alberta and is heading to Port Roberts in British Columbia for export. Coal is hauled in unit trains of upwards of 100 cars. Why is there a locomotive in the middle of the train? It's a helper engine and is controlled by the engineer on the lead locomotive. This is a potash train, typically 100 or more grate-covered hoppers. Potash is mined primarily in Saskatchewan and exported to the United States and overseas for use as fertilizer. Canada is one of the world's largest sulfur producers and the world's largest exporter. Sulfur is mostly produced in Alberta and is shipped in unit trains of 100+ open hoppers, usually branded Sultran. Sulfur is used in the chemical, paper, and medicine industries. Manifest freights carry many different types of cars: hoppers, boxcars, tank cars, lumber cars, gondolas, and auto racks. The cars on the head end of this westbound train are tri-level automobile carriers. Canada is also a major producer and exporter of grain. Grain is carried in unit trains and hopper cars marked with the grain symbol, and often in colorful cars from the major grain-producing provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Intermodal trains carry containers, either double-stacked in a well car or a single container on a flat car. Unlike coal, potash, sulfur, and grain trains which travel west loaded and east empty, intermodal trains can be loaded in either direction. Obviously, a train needs locomotives to move. These are SD40-2s. For many years the backbone of the Canadian Pacific's locomotive fleet, and indeed that of many U.S. railroads. Seen here in 2 different paint schemes, these 2 locomotives were built in 1978 by the Electromotive Division of General Motors in LaGrange, Illinois. They weigh in at 393,000 pounds and develop 3,000 horsepower. Introduced in 1995, these General Electric AC-44s can be found in all kinds of freight service. Built in Erie, Pennsylvania, the units develop 4,400 horsepower and weigh in at 411,000 pounds. The wide nose provides better protection for the crew in the event of a collision, and the angled nose enables the engineer to see crewmen riding on the steps during a switching operation. The SD90 Mac is GMD's latest high-tech locomotive. Built in London, Ontario, they develop 4,300 horsepower and are upgradable to 6,000 horsepower. These huge locomotives weigh in at 425,000 pounds and can be seen in any kind of freight service. After hundreds of miles of flatland running across the prairies, Canadian Pacific meets the tight curves and steep grades of the Rocky Mountains near Exshaw, Alberta. The Rockies pose a formidable challenge even to today's high-horsepower locomotives. On their way to our final destination of Revelstoke, British Columbia, the trains will pass through Yoho National Park, Banff National Park, Glacier National Park, and the edge of Mount Revelstoke National Park. We'll see the magnificent scenery of the Rockies and Selkirks Mountains, take some side trips to scenic attractions, and see some of the wildlife in this beautiful region. We'll see trains negotiating the incredible engineering feat of the spiral tunnels and ride through the Western Hemisphere's longest tunnel underneath Mount Macdonald in the engineer's seat. We'll learn some of the history of the region and about the construction of the railroad. So sit back and enjoy your ride along the tracks of the Beaver, Canadian Pacific's transcontinental mainline through the Rocky and Selkirk Mountains. Our first train is the beautiful Royal Canadian Pacific on its publicity run running through the Bow River Valley near Exshaw, Alberta. Several of the key political players in the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway were Scottish, and they left a legacy of Scottish names on the railway through British Columbia and Alberta. Banff townsite was named after the Scottish county of Banffshire. In 1880, 3 prospectors found hot springs in the area. The Canadian government got involved, and in 1885, 10 square miles of the area became the Banff Hot Springs Reservation, the forerunner of the Banff National Park, which today protects 2,564 square miles and hosts some 3 million visitors annually. The Banff Springs Hotel was built by the Canadian Pacific Railway and was the first chateau-style hotel. The hotel was built to bring tourists into the area to help pay for the huge debt incurred in constructing the railway. The hotel opened in 1888 and was the largest hotel in the world at the time. Today, the hotel has 867 rooms. Immediately to the west of the Banff town site are the Vermilion Lakes. This is an excellent area to see wildlife, and bald eagles and osprey nest in the area. The 3 Vermilion Lakes are the remnants of a large lake. The area now has extensive marsh wetlands. Mount Rundle, Banff's most famous mountain, can be seen reflected in the lakes. The Bow Valley Parkway diverges from the Trans-Canada Highway just west of Banff. Completed in 1920, This two-lane road runs on the north side of Canadian Pacific's tracks and the Bow River to Lake Louise. There are a number of interpretive displays, and the opportunity to see wildlife is great. This is ideal habitat for elk. During the summer, the females stay in the valley bottoms with their calves, while the males are at higher elevations. Black bears may be seen on the parkway. Principally nocturnal, they eat berries, leaves, insects, and carrion. Bears are unpredictable and dangerous and should be avoided. The wetlands here at Muleshoe were part of an oxbow formed when the river took a more direct course. Cut off when the railroad was built, Muleshoe is now a stagnant lake filling with vegetation. The area has a Columbian ground squirrel colony, and trembling aspen are abundant in the area. Johnston Canyon evolved as Johnston Creek eroded its way into cracks in the limestone bedrock. In places, it's less than 18 feet wide, and at its deepest, it's more than 90 feet. There are 7 waterfalls, marking the location of harder rocks. The path runs on a wooden walkway in the deepest part of the canyon. James Hector of the Palliser expedition gave Castle Mountain its name in 1858. The sheer limestone and dolomite cliffs, separated by broad shale ledges, erode into turrets and pinnacles, giving the mountain its distinctive shape. Silver City was a mining town at the foot of Castle Mountain that flourished in the 1880s, but the silver turned out to be a dream and not reality, and the town was soon abandoned. Nicholas Morant, Canadian Pacific's photographer for more than 50 years, gave his name to the curve he made famous in CP's publicity photographs. The Continental Divide runs along the summits of the mountains in the background, and Wengchemna Range near Lake Louise. Mount Temple at 11,626 feet is the third highest mountain in Banff National Park. These spectacular views are from the side of the Bow Valley Parkway. These Canada geese are eating grain that has leaked from the rail cars. A side road climbs from the Lake Louise Visitor Center some 10 miles to Moraine Lake through the Valley of the 10 Peaks. Mount Temple, named after Sir Richard Temple, patron leader of a scientific expedition that visited the Rockies in 1884, dominates the region. The glacier on the top of Mount Temple was named the MacDonald Glacier after Canada's first Prime Minister. Walter Wilcox, the first visitor to Moraine Lake, named the lake assuming that it was dammed by a moraine deposited by the Wengchemna Glacier, but it's likely that he was incorrect, and the dam was formed by a rock slide from the cliffs to the south. Wengchemna is a stony Indian word for 10, thus the Wengchemna Range, the 10 Peaks. Canadian Pacific began development of its hotel at Lake Louise in earnest in the early 1900s, culminating in the addition of the Painter Wing in 1913. With a capacity of 400 guests, the chateau became a major destination in the Rockies, second only to the Banff Springs Hotel. Mount Victoria dominates the background of Lake Louise. Named for Queen Victoria, the mountain is 11,365 feet high, and Lake Louise, named for Queen Victoria's daughter, is frozen from November to June, and the water rarely gets over 40 degrees, even in summer. The lake is 1.5 miles long and about 270 feet deep. The station at Lake Louise is now a restaurant and has 2 dining cars that are available for parties. The station is one of only 2 or 3 log stations left on the line. Trains no longer stop here. The Icefield Parkway runs 144 miles from the Trans-Canada Highway near Lake Louise to Jasper. Construction began in 1931, and the road opened to automobile traffic in 1940. Originally gravel, the highway was upgraded in 1961. The scenic highlight of the parkway has to be the Columbia Icefield, the largest sheet of glacial ice in North America. Its meltwaters feed 3 of Canada's largest river systems and eventually reach 3 oceans, the Pacific, the Arctic, and the Atlantic. The icefield covers more than 200 square miles, and the maximum known thickness of ice is almost 1,100 feet. Of the 30 highest peaks in the Rockies, 13 adjoin the Columbia Icefield. Stephen is west of the Continental Divide and is just over the border in British Columbia. In the background is Cathedral Mountain. Canadian Pacific's route across Kicking Horse Pass is a storied piece of railroad, difficult to survey and explore through rugged terrain, difficult and costly to build, and difficult and dangerous to operate. Originally, surveys indicated that the easiest route through the Rocky Mountains was via Yellowhead Pass in what is now Jasper National Park. Because of fears that the United States would run branch lines into Alberta and British Columbia from its soon-to-be-completed Northern Pacific, and that the U.S. would claim southern BC and Alberta as its territories, Canadian Pacific picked the Kicking Horse Pass route. A proposed route through Kicking Horse Pass was shorter than the route through the Yellowhead Pass, and less cutting and filling of the grade on the prairies would be needed. So Kicking Horse Pass was selected, despite being the most rugged pass across the Continental Divide in the Southern Rockies, and that a route through the Selkirks to the west had not yet been discovered. Canadian Pacific was staking the company's and Canada's financial viability on building a railway across the Kicking Horse Pass and finding a route through the Selkirks. An American, Major A.B. Rogers, arrived in Canada in 1881. In his 50s, he wore an outlandish mustache and seemingly survived on a diet of beans, hardtack, and chewing tobacco. He had proved himself as a railway surveyor for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, but his selection to find a route through the Rockies and Selkirks annoyed the Canadian surveyors who had been working in the fields for decades and drew criticism from the Canadian press. Surveying crews led by Walter Moberly spent 3 seasons in the 1860s and 70s searching for an east-west pass through the Selkirks. They surveyed all the major valleys on the western slopes of the Selkirks except the Illecillewaet, and it was to here that Rogers turned in 1881. Hampered by deep snowpack, Rogers and a party of surveyors headed to the crest of the pass from what is now Revelstoke. The pass was puzzling, as it was oriented north-south, and not east-west as Rogers had hoped. Not having requisitioned enough food, the party was forced to return without knowing if the pass led across the Selkirks or was a dead end. Following this failure, Rogers traveled to the eastern slope of the Rockies to examine several passes across the Continental Divide. By the end of 1881, no route through the Rockies had been found. Yet, construction of the railroad was advancing toward the mountains from both directions. In May of 1882, Rogers led another unsuccessful attempt to find a pass through the Selkirks from the Columbia Valley in the east. Again, the party was undersupplied and nearly starved in their struggle through the inhospitable terrain. In July, Rogers set off again from the Columbia River, northeast of Golden, and followed the path of the Beaver River. After more than a week of arduous struggle through the dense undergrowth, Rogers and his party emerged onto the heights of the north-south pass they had reached the previous summer. The Selkirks had been breached, and the route became Rogers Pass. Rogers completed his survey in 1883 and reported to the Canadian Pacific Railway that a satisfactory route existed across the Rockies and the Selkirks. Major Rogers' route through the Kicking Horse Pass followed the CPR's charter stipulations that the maximum grade of the railroad could not exceed 2.2%. After assessing the cost of construction of Rogers' proposed route, William Cornelius Van Horn, general manager of the CPR during its construction, put forward a temporary solution to the high construction cost. This was a line straight to the floor of the Kicking Horse Valley from Wapta Lake, with a grade of almost 5%. This line was eventually constructed and became known as the Big Hill. Difficult and very dangerous to operate because of the steep grade and a very high risk of runaway trains and wrecks, reconstruction of the line eventually took place, and the incredible engineering feat of the spiral tunnels replaced the steep grade. The CPR operated the Big Hill for more than 23 years, and though there were several catastrophic wrecks and many derailments, not a single passenger was killed. The spiral tunnels were opened on August 25, 1909. A train needs to be approximately 90 cars long to loop over itself. The spiral tunnel viewing area of the Trans-Canada Highway is one of the most popular attractions in Yoho National Park. Long trains can be seen looping over themselves before passing in front of the viewing area. Because the tracks are in a national park, the trees cannot be cut, and the view is becoming quite restricted. In the days of the Big Hill, there were 3 safety switches leading to spur tracks. The switches were manned around the clock, and engineers had to blow 4 blasts on the whistle to let the switchman know that the train was under control. Otherwise, the switch would be thrown, and the train diverted to keep wrecks off the main line. The Trans-Canada Highway now occupies most of the old grade. The lower spiral tunnel is 2,923 feet long and curves through 226 degrees. The tunnel is located in Mount Ogden and has a change in grade of 50 feet. The spiral tunnels reduced a 5% grade on Kicking Horse Pass to 2.2%, enabling fewer locomotives to haul more cars up the hill. The upper spiral tunnel in Cathedral Crag is 3,254 feet long, curves through 288 degrees, and has a change in elevation of 56 feet. The spiral tunnels were inspired by tunnels on the St. Gotthard Railway in Switzerland. Before their construction, other passes in the Rockies were considered and again rejected. An electric railway from the summit to field was rejected, as was a tunnel. Because of avalanche danger on the slopes of the mountains of the Yoho Valley, looping the rails around the sides of the mountains was rejected, and so the spiral tunnels came to be. is an avalanche shelter beneath the imposing bulk of Cathedral Crags. The enormous avalanche path, known as the Big Slide, carries avalanches from a broad gully on Mount Stephen. The avalanches are caused by ice calving from the terminus of the glacier, carrying ice, snow, and debris down the mountain. The shelter diverts avalanches over the tracks. The Yoho Valley Road turns off the Trans-Canada Highway at the bottom of the Big Hill. One of the attractions along the road is the meeting of the waters. The Yoho River joins the Kicking Horse here. The Yoho is thick with glacial till, which gives its water a dirty gray appearance. The road is narrow and climbs a series of switchbacks. The Yoho Valley Road ends at the Takakau Falls. With a combined drop of 833 feet, the falls are one of the highest in both Canada and the world. Takakau, meaning it is wonderful in Cree, is fed by meltwater from the Daly Glacier. The Kicking Horse River has its origins in meltwater from the Wapta and Waputtik ice fields. Glacial meltwater contains a large amount of rubble known as till. At the bottom of the Big Hill, most of the larger particles drop out of the river and form a gravelly outwash plain. The community of Field developed from a railway construction camp and was named for Cyrus Field, a promoter of the first transatlantic telegraph cable, who visited the area in 1884. Mount Stephen House, the CPR's first mountain hotel, was constructed here in 1886. CPR had a depot here as well as a freight yard, a roundhouse, water tank, and a turntable. The Mount Stephen House was sold to the YMCA in 1918 and demolished in 1953. Today, Field is a crew change point and the division point between the Lagan Sub and the Mountain Sub. There is a crew bunkhouse here, but the roundhouse and turntable are long gone. The curve at Ottertail is another location made famous by Nicholas Morant. This spectacular location was used by the CPR for many publicity photographs. Lencoil was another favorite location of Morant, but the famous publicity shot has been spoiled by the Trans-Canada Highway overpass and power lines. Lencoil marks the start of the 2.2% grade down the Kicking Horse Canyon to Golden. John Palliser was born in Dublin, Ireland, and spent some time on the American prairies. He convinced the British government to finance an expedition to find a route through the Canadian colony's Rocky Mountains. The expedition sailed from Liverpool to New York in 1857 aboard the steamer Arabia. One of the expedition members was James Hector, a medical doctor, geologist, and naturalist. In September 1858, near the confluence of the Beaver and Kicking Horse rivers above Wapta Falls, Hector was kicked in the chest by his horse. His men called the river they were following Kicking Horse. Palliser sighting is named after John Palliser. The Kicking Horse has carved a deep canyon through the mountains. The railway winds along the river, while the highway clings to the steep mountain slopes. Golden was originally optimistically named Golden City, although no gold was ever found near here. The viewpoint affords a good view of the Rocky Mountain Trench, a very long valley extending from the U.S. border to northern British Columbia. The trench is occupied by the Columbia River and divides the Rocky Mountains from the Purcell Range of the Columbia Mountains. Canadian Pacific has a coal train service facility at the south end of the town. CP carries coal from southern Alberta and British Columbia through Crow's Nest Pass to Golden and onto Roberts Bank near Vancouver for export. There is a shop facility to service coal hoppers and a yard to accommodate coal trains. A local heads east from Ford towards Golden. It's picked up some cement hoppers at a local industry and is trailing a caboose, rare these days. Heading west is a Manifest Freight, the General Electric locomotives wearing two different paint schemes, the new Beaver logo and the twin flag schemes that preceded it. A loaded coal train heads west. The locomotive on the rear of the train is radio controlled by the engineer on the lead locomotive. Donald lies at the eastern approaches to the Selkirk Range of the Columbia Mountains. The town was named for Donald Smith, a CPR director during the railway's construction. Beyond Donald, the railroad runs alongside the Columbia River and is single-tracked with passing sidings. Beaver Mouth is the former location of a helper station. Helper locomotives were added to westbound trains here to help them up the grade to Rogers Pass. The Columbia River Valley was flooded in the early 1970s when the Mica Dam was built, forming the Ken Basket Lake. The helper station was moved west to Rogers, but the location of the old grade can still be seen on the lake bed during the periods of low water. The point that the Beaver River enters the Ken Basket Lake is the most northerly point on the Canadian Pacific's transcontinental main line. In the late 1970s, increased traffic with heavier trains led CP to begin a massive project to reduce the grade for heavy-loaded westbound trains over Rogers Pass. More than 10 miles of new track was built. This westbound train is on the new track, which starts at Frayne, just past the old Rogers helper station. And eastbound drops down the grade on the old track. The grade separation can be seen clearly, with the westbound intermodal train on the new track, seen from a viewpoint on the Trans-Canada Highway. The old line crosses Stony Creek on a steel arch bridge, while the new line crosses the creek below it. The old Stony Creek Bridge was another favorite location of Nicholas Morant for CP publicity photographs. The original bridge was built in 1893, and a second steel arch was added in 1929 to accommodate larger and heavier locomotives. Because the CP line here is located in Glacier National Park, CP worked closely with the Canadian Park Service to minimize disruption to the park. The 4,031-foot-long John Fox Viaduct was built so that the new tracks would not have to be cut into the hillside. The viaduct begins near Stony Creek and continues to the east portal of the Shaughnessy Tunnel. The Trans-Canada Highway over Rogers Pass was completed in 1962 and is partially constructed on the old railroad right-of-way. Visible to the right of the highway is a masonry arch bridge over Cascade Creek. The railroad had a steep and difficult climb from both sides of the pass. Helper locomotives were needed, and during the winter, avalanches were common. Over 200 people were killed by avalanches between 1885 and 1911. The railroad had to move the Summit station 4 times before finally abandoning the pass when the Connaught Tunnel was opened in 1916. The tunnel passes directly under Mount Macdonald and is named for Queen Victoria's third son, the Duke of Connaught, Governor General of Canada from 1911 to 1916. The tunnel was originally double-tracked, but was single-tracked in 1959 to accommodate the then new automobile carriers. The 5-mile-long Connaught Tunnel is used by eastbounds and is basically straight on a slight descending grade. It cut more than 750 vertical feet from the original surface route over the pass. The machinery of the tunnel portal is blowers to remove smoke from the tunnel.
Generally, when the tunnel's clean, you can see the light at the other end from here.
At somewhat over 9 miles, the Mount Macdonald Tunnel is the longest in the Western Hemisphere. Built to reduce the westbound grade for heavily loaded trains and reduce the need for helper locomotives, it increased the westbound capacity of the line from 12 to 15 trains a day to about 24 trains a day. The tunnel passes through Mount Macdonald and Mount Cheops before emerging on the west side of Rogers Pass. The Mount Macdonald Tunnel and the Connaught Tunnel cross at different elevations inside Mount Macdonald, almost directly under the mountain's 9,400-foot summit. At that point, there is about 5,800 feet of rock above the Connaught Tunnel, and about 6,200 feet of rock above the Mount Macdonald Tunnel. The tunnel is concrete lined throughout and is tall enough to accommodate overhead wiring if CP ever decides to electrify the tunnel. The rails through the tunnel are laid on a concrete slab. As we emerge from the tunnel, the Rocky Mountaineer tour train is on our left. The Mountaineer is virtually the only train to head west of the normally eastbound Connaught track, and this gives the passengers a better view from the higher track. walking west, Rogers Pass is to our right, and the Trans-Canada Highway and the Connaught Track can be seen below us. By using the Connaught and Mount Macdonald tunnels, trains avoid the most intensive avalanche danger in the section of line that was exposed to the deepest snowfall. However, there are still places, particularly on the western slopes, that are exposed to avalanches. Snow sheds protect the tracks and carry snow over the tracks so that they are not blocked by avalanches. Revelstoke is another crew change point and the end of the mountain sub and the start of the shoe swap sub. There's a small yard here, but little switching or maintenance is done. It's mostly a staging yard where trains are held waiting for fresh crews. Revelstoke's original name was Big Eddy because of the abrupt bend in the Columbia River here. When the railway surveyors arrived, they named it Second Crossing for the crossing of the Columbia River here. Mount Revelstoke is a national park. A road winds its way to the top and many scenic views are available. A crew boards a westbound as an eastbound pulls into the former depot, now CP offices. Little time is wasted getting the trains on their way again. As the trains carry on their journey east to Calgary and beyond, and west to Vancouver, we have reached the end of our journey through Canada's beautiful Rocky and Selkirk Mountains. Thanks for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this Canadian railway adventure. If you have enjoyed this program, you might like to check out the companion rail adventure Rails to the Kenai. You'll travel aboard the Alaska Railroad's Anchorage to Seward train alongside the Turnagain Arm and through the spectacular scenery of the Kenai Peninsula. On the way, you'll see glaciers and lofty peaks reflected in the serene lakes, moose, Dall sheep, bald eagles, and the trains themselves passing through the scenery. At Seward, you will take a boat ride to the Kenai Fjords National Park and an airplane ride to see the brown bear. Truly spectacular.